I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Same age group, same profession, but different productivity levels. And this isn't just limited to this one instance. There are various cases where some people put in more time and more effort, but other people investing less work seem to get further ahead. Experts would say the difference is between working hard and working smart. But what really does working smart mean? And in a world where certain qualities and traits are valued more than others, is the statement anything is possible with hard work holding less weight now than ever before? On today's show, we discuss this in detail. We're joined by Cyril, who's the author of the best-selling book, Work Smarter, Live Better, which has been ranked in the top 100 business books worldwide. Cyril is also a thought leader in the areas of productivity and time management and in work-life balance. He joins us from Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us, Cyril. Now, before we start, I'd like your definition of what working smart means and how we can make sense out of it when we're comparing it to working hard.
I think we shouldn't exclude both of them. It's not working hard versus working smart, but it's also making the difference between the two. So in a very simple way, working hard is more linked to what I call the efficiency. So I'm going to say, okay, Meshal, how efficient are you? I give you something to do, you do it quick, and so I can give you lots of things to do. You're going to work long hours, you're going to manage many meetings, you're going to manage many emails. The working hard is linked to the effort that you put in. Working smart is different. Working smart is more linked to, are you doing the right things? Are you doing the thing that really matters? Let me get an example. You can work hours and hours and hours, work really hard, but if you're not working on the right things, if you're not working on the few things that's going to have the most impact, then you're not working smart.
Right.
Now, if you can bring both, if you can work smart and hard, then you have amazing productivity.
Right. But a lot of people have difficulty in cracking this code. I mean, some people figure it out sooner than others and they get their way ahead. But others, they seem to be in this slump. They're putting in a lot of hours, they're putting in a lot of effort, but they don't know where they're going wrong. If you had to pinpoint this one trait that you would say is the key to working smart, what do you think that would be?
It's an interesting question. Last year, I was asked by Microsoft. Microsoft is one of my clients, and I was doing a roadshow for them in Australia. So I live in Australia. I have clients around the world, but in this case, I was doing a roadshow for Microsoft in Australia. And we're working in all the different states to talk with their clients about new tools, new technology, and new behavior. And at the end of it, and I mentioned that because at the end of it, I did a little interview like we're doing now for their internal TV. And they asked me exactly the same question. And when I train a team, I take them to a 4 months journey to work smarter. But they, like you, they say, give us the one tip, the one thing. And exactly the same thing. What is the one thing that will make the difference? And it was a hard one. And I really, your question is not very easy to just pinpoint just one thing.
Right.
So I thought about it. And my answer is this. If I have to give one suggestion about work smart, I'll use this one. Prioritize by impact. Simple word. But what does that mean? A lot of people, the way they prioritize is because of deadline. A lot of people, what they do is to think about, I've got many things to do. So if I take your example, if I take my example, imagine that we have 10 things to do. We have things which are due for tonight, things which are due in a week time, and things which are due in a 3 months time. Most people will start by the one which is due tonight, then we'll do the one which is due in a week time, and then the one in 3 months. And that's what we most do. I think we need to shift that. And I think the key question in my mind is prioritize by impact. Ask yourself this simple question. What's going to have the most impact long term? And that's work smart.
Right.
And so you might say something is due tonight and something is due in 3 months. If the thing that is due in 3 months is going to have much more impact long term, start with the thing which is due in 3 months. This is probably the simplest suggestion I can make.
Right. And that is a valuable suggestion you're making here. Now, so you talk a lot about work-life balance, and that's something that I want to talk to you about next as well. Now, in this world where there's a lot of talk about if you have goals and if you have ambition, there is a compromise to be made on your personal life or your family life to get what you want, just because of how competitive everything has gotten. But do you think that it's possible, given all the competitiveness, given the harsh conditions, that you can actually maintain a balance?
I think not only it's possible, I think it's very, very important. Let me give you an example. Someone described our life in a very simple way as juggling balls. We all talk about our life is like juggling balls in the air, and we're juggling many balls. Well, you might be, you've got a lot of work balls that you're juggling. You've got, some family balls. You've got some health balls. So you're juggling balls in the air. And the image I really like is you need to think about those balls as different. Some are bouncy ball, work, for example. Some are more fragile, like eggs. If you drop your work, well, for me, it's going to bounce back and you'll find another job. That's not, in your life, you're going to go through several jobs and they bounce back. But your family, your health, if you drop them, they're more like eggs, they can break. And I think that's the image I want to give, is to say we need to be really careful how we treat all these different balls. Now, there might be time in your life where you put a lot of effort at work, but dropping the family ball, dropping the passion balls, dropping the health balls, in my view, is very dangerous. Right. Now, I agree with you. When you're at work, you have a boss that push you, that give you KPIs, that give you things to do, that check that you're doing. And so you push to do this. Well, you don't have that at home. But I think making sure that you have the right balance is really important. It's a really important skill to have, really important for me.
Right. Cyril, the thing about working smart that comes to my mind is also trying to leverage the strong points you have and trying to see what you can do best with them. But that also means that a degree of flexibility is given to you, whether it's in your workplace or whatever environment you're operating in. Now, given the type of workplaces that we are used to working in, which don't give humans that room for creative thinking or imagination, or even to allow certain skills to foster, do you think that people are allowed to explore that side?
Yeah, I think so. I think and it's up to you to take it. I mean, you can do your job just as a robot and do what you have to do. But I think everyone, whatever your role in the company, needs to bring a certain level of proactivity, of imagination, of creation. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, before, I started this business 13 years ago. But before of that, I was the director of sales for a big company. And we had a call center. And now, how much more reactive, Meshal, is a call center person? Call center person is there and is just answering call. So that's super reactive job with very little imagination, very little creation and so on. I'll never forget the time where one of the call center person, Philip, came to me and he said, Cyril, and he came to me and the call center manager. So I was the director of sales. The call center manager was reporting to me, and this guy was reporting, Philip was reporting to the call center manager. And he came and said, could I have a meeting with both of you? He said, of course. He said, look, we always have this problem in the call center. We get this kind of call. I can't remember exactly what it was, but we always get this kind of calls, and it's always really difficult to handle. So I took it on myself. I went to purchase a software, and I designed a little solution for it, and I've got an idea that I'd like to share. What really amazed me is this person who had the most reactive job on us, still on his own, decided to use his creativity, his proactiveness. And I think for everyone at every level, bringing, whether you're asked to do it or not, if you bring this, then you're going to bring your job and you're going to bring your performance to a completely different level. Right. And guess who got promoted very soon? Guess who was the top performer of that team? Of course it was Philip. Everyone can bring that, in my view.
Right. Cyril, I want to go back to the title of your book, which is Work Smarter, Live Better. Now, this title itself seems like working smart is almost essential to have a better life. Can you give us a sense of why do you think that is, just from the title and what you mention in your book onwards?
Okay, two things I'll mention. One is there's a master in our area called Stephen Covey. Some people and some of your listeners might have heard about this great book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Stephen Covey became a master in the area of being productive, being effective. Really interesting, Stephen Covey, a few years after writing The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, wrote another book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families. What I'm trying to say there is the skills of being effective are exactly the same at a personal level or at a business level. Now, let me explain a second thing on this one. We work with a lot of big companies around the world. So a lot of big bank, pharmaceutical company, consulting company, lawyers. They're our clients and we work with them around the world. And when we start the journey, a lot of those leaders, a lot of those managers think that it is about clearing their inbox, managing their files, managing their time, improving how they manage their meetings. And it is, we do a lot of that, but they soon realize something really important, that by transforming, by changing your work habits, you can completely transform your life. Today, I was reviewing the feedback from one of our clients, and we're talking about a leadership group, a big insurance company in London. Leadership group went this journey that lasted 4 months. The feedback I had from one of the leaders is by changing my work habit, it completely transformed my life. People don't see it at the beginning, and as they start transforming their habits, it completely changed their life. And I've seen it so many times.
Right. And on that point, and this is just the last question that I do want to ask you, we're hearing so much about how the younger generations especially are becoming more and more disillusioned, especially when they enter the workforce. Previous generations, there is more anxiety. Of course, that has a lot to do with the economic situations, other factors at play, but it also has to do with the fact that there is a lack of a work-life balance. Just with everything that's happening, how essential do you see people having to figure out that it is important to prioritize, to have better working habits, and to make things happen in a more systematic way in order to have a better lifestyle?
I think it's critical, but I think a lot of companies are starting realizing this because, well, this new generation is asking questions. Again, one of my clients is a big law firm in Australia. Now, this law firm, the old generation, are used to working crazy hours, are used to responding to emails evening, weekends, and they're getting a shock because the new generation of lawyers that are coming, that are now in their early 30s, 35, are starting coming and saying, hang on, that's not the life we want. Right. And the law firm is starting realizing that if they want to attract talent, and we all know the war on talent, the importance of attracting the right talents, you need to cater for work-life balance. Those young talents who are the future, and sorry, they're not even the future, they're the present. If you don't cater for their work-life balance, then you're not going to attract them and retain them. So it's now becoming a productivity or a competitive advantage to really think about that. That's the reality of today, in my view.
Thank you for joining us, Cyril Peupion. That was Cyril joining us from Sydney. Now we're joined by Klint Janulis, who's the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Archaeology at the University of Colorado, joining us from Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us, Klint, and welcome to the show. Klint, when we hear about working smart, something that is often associated to it is the person's personality, how sociable they are, how well they network. But in all of this, of course, one of the factors that is to be taken into consideration is how well they speak the language, how well they are able to sit with certain groups of people. In that, how much of a role do you think privilege plays?
I think in something like what you're talking about, it's a tremendously important role. And I can speak as somebody who grew up very working class and wasn't exposed to those networks and the people that move in the higher education level professions. And it was later in life that I got exposed to it and started learning how to navigate those systems, but also speaking that language. So that exposure and that networking is something that people in certain classes are sort of born into. And so that gives them a big advantage in their work-life career right off the bat.
Right.
And that's something that working class people often have to play catch up on if they want to achieve the same goals.
And when you're saying playing catch up on it, how difficult do you think it must have been for you? And when you see examples, how difficult do you think is that race then for people who haven't been born into that culture? How difficult is it for them to catch up?
There are a lot of factors in this, particularly when we start talking about privilege, but depending on how far removed you are from anybody who has access to that culture or that infrastructure, it can be almost impossible. And it really is just a matter of where you're at and how much exposure you've got. So in my example, I only started learning about it just because I happened to have a few friends when I was an enlisted soldier in the military who'd come from that world. And they sort of taught me how to navigate it, which eventually led from me being an enlisted soldier to doing a doctorate program at the University of Oxford, where it's an entirely different level of structure and hierarchy for someone to get into that sort of a university. And seeing the networks, realizing just how important those are and how inaccessible they can be for a lot of working class people.
Right. And on that point, I want to introduce another guest who's just joined us, Dr. Nina Markovic, who's teaching security studies at Macquarie University. She's joining us from Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Markovic. Now, when we're talking about privilege, and Klint gave us his experience, but you as a professor teaching students, do you feel like that also factors into the success of how students perform, especially when you're comparing certain students who are working very hard, but they perhaps don't come from the same backgrounds in which the system perhaps rewards or prefers?
Well, in Australia, most students actually work in jobs, part-time jobs, and they work very hard in their studies. So they actually have a double role of work. So work for them means something else compared to, let's say, students in some other countries. So a lot of students, you see, in Australia, a lot of exams are not done in a traditional way anymore. A lot of courses have assignments to reduce the pressure. But there is also an argument that through assignments there can be plagiarism. So working hard for some students means working day and night, but for others means Googling a company that can do their assignments for them. And this has been a big problem in Australia at actually all 8 main Australian universities. So when you look at, you asked about experiences, experiences definitely help. But sometimes students can also overthink, and they can put themselves too personally involved in the subject area that they are looking at. Now that can actually be disadvantage to them. So keeping that distance from the subject that you're studying, in my opinion, is vitally important. You can't be too close to the subject. Often I actually tell my students, especially at the postgraduate level, they need to study something which annoys them. Because when you are annoyed a little bit at something, it will keep your attention and passion, especially if you have a 4-year project or even a 2-year project. But also in assignment, at the assignment level, if something bugs you and annoys you, you will keep persisting. If something is too happy and you just don't feel anything towards the subject area, often those students will perform a bit more poorly because they will not be engaged involved.
Right. There is also this thing that working smart is also needed in these times because of how fast things are moving. Do you feel like the fast pace has also impacted the education sector in that way? The way things are taught, the way things the way students engage with material, Dr. Nina?
Believe it or not, in many courses, lectures are now done online. Actually, many courses don't even have money to actually bring humans to deliver lectures. So a lot of courses are pre-recorded and delivered online, assignments are sent online, so the human factor is actually being lost. You also have this information overload. You have students looking at thousands of databases, thousands of material, and actually being completely paralyzed, not knowing where to turn to. Course guidelines are quite important, but they're quite limited at the same time. So in my opinion, communication with a lecturer or with your superior in a workplace is paramount, because then you can narrow down the focus of what you're researching. Secondly, you have to look at your sources. For example, in my previous role, I was the senior parliamentary advisor, and sometimes you had 3 hours to answer a question of, how many active nuclear warheads does a country X have? Now, of course, you're not going to call Minister of Defense of that country, but you need to know your sources very fast, and the most reliable sources at hand, you will use them. So technology can actually be quite disadvantaged to work with you or against you. You just have to see what you have at hand, and also experience in this regard is very important.
Right. I take you there. Klint, now, the American dream, this concept didn't just exist in the United States. It was globalized, that if you work hard enough, you can achieve your dreams wherever you are in the world. But at the same time, what we're seeing nowadays is that inequality is gravely increasing, and it's greatly pronounced in the more developed nations. Do you think people are realizing that hard work is just not enough to get them where they want to get? And do you think that this value that was taught to people through movies, through books, just doesn't hold the same amount of weight as it did before?
The notion of hard work getting you where you want to be is very interesting, because as Dr. Markovic, if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I'm sorry, mentioned that humans have sort of lost touch through the educational process with being engaged with the material. Now, one of the things I found interesting in my process, I had to learn how to learn. And I didn't learn that in my education traditionally. I had to learn it through the Army. And I was just fortunate. I had a roommate, a colleague, who had gone to an Ivy League school, and he taught me how to learn, because nobody had ever shown me this process. But it's a very engaged material process. And for me, it was about writing down physical notes. And there's been a lot of interesting research that shows that when you tie an engaging, active procedural skill, such as handwriting, with knowledge and learning, what you're doing is called cross-domain thinking, and it helps you retain information more readily, and it helps you access it more quickly. And I agree again with the other statements you made about information overload.
Right.
This is a problem for everybody, and managing that is something I think the university systems need to really start getting on, because it's part of the student body mental health, as well as their success rate. But I'm in graduate school. I'm just nearly done, and I can tell you that so many of my fellow students are having mental health problems trying to finish their doctorate programs because of just that thing. We are expected to process so much data. And as an archaeologist, I look at a paper published in 1970, and the bibliography for that paper might only have 40 sources. Today, you'll see papers that are 10 pages long and have 20 pages of bibliographic sources, because they are almost expected to cite as much as possible because all that information is out there. And it is really daunting for someone like myself, particularly since I have ADHD and can't focus on anything. I can't imagine what it's like for students who don't have the support I have just because of a good family. I've got the GI Bill from the military. I've got great support. But if I didn't have that, I would be struggling quite a lot, I think.
Absolutely. Dr. Nina, that raises the question, it begs the question that does there need to be a more meaningful change to the way things are taught in order for hard work, not just hard work, but people's efforts to be rewarded, and not just rewarded, but when we're talking about education, there being meaningful engagement and knowledge being knowledge, not just going through the motion?
Definitely. if you look at how some traditional systems are still teaching, I was lecturing in Italy, for example, and the way some Italian universities work, the professor just talks for 2 hours and students literally take notes. Some of them fall asleep during that process. It's like a monologue. And that is a completely, in my opinion, unproductive way of teaching. In Australia, depends on the lecturer, of course, but we do try to use audiovisual sources. So I think if you try to engage students in terms of their perceptions at different levels, not just through your voice, but through visuals, through different methods of presenting data, to bringing maybe halfway through your own lecture some other person to talk about their experiences, even if it's 5 minutes. I think that more interactive engagement with student body is definitely going to be helpful. I mean, just imagine yourself listening to something for hours and hours. It's not going to engage the brain. So I guess perhaps also because we live in this interactive world, our brains need different points of stimuli to work better and function, but not to be overstimulated at the same time. So that balance needs to be maintained.
Right. On that point, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nina Markovic. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to take our discussion forward. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we discuss what happens when you work hard, but you don't seem to get where you want to, but when someone invests less amount of time, less amount of effort, but they seem to get further ahead. That's about working smart. A lot of experts, we've talked to them, they're telling us different sides of the story. But now joining us is Mr. Patrick Sullivan, who is the chairman and CEO of Parliament Street, which is a London-based think tank, joining us from London. We're also continuing with Mr. Klint Janulis, who has joined us from Oxford. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Sullivan, now, when we're talking about working smart, of course, there is a need for it. And we were talking earlier about the work-life balance that is required. But give us a sense of how much of a stress epidemic there's existing in the market, which requires for people to, in fact, start prioritizing their health and working in a more effective and in a more smarter way.
Parliament Street released some research which we conducted this weekend, which showed that over 1/3 of UK workers believe that their employer doesn't care about their mental or financial well-being. And the poll was of over 2,000 full-time UK workers in professional roles. And we examined the pressures placed on employees as well as money worries and concerns over Brexit. A very disturbing figure was that 4 in 10 people admitted to lying to their family members and colleagues about their financial and mental well-being. And I think one of the best ways to cure a problem is to acknowledge a problem.
Right.
I know in the UK, I don't know about anywhere else, but there's a stress epidemic.
Right. And you're talking about how there needs to be an acknowledgement of the problem. Now, we hear a lot about mental health. People talking more about it now, firms talking about it. But do you think there's actual steps being taken to address it?
There's beginning to be, but there's not enough. It's a large human problem, and but it's also a large economic problem. What stress does is it slows our brains and our bodies down. It makes us feel unwell. If we are able to reduce stress, we can improve our performance across the board. I mean, less stress equals quicker thinking and improved creative problem-solving ability. So for employers to get the best from their employees, it's actually in their own self-interest to show an interest in the well-being of their workforce. It's just another occurrence of when doing the right thing also happens to be the smart thing. Or to put it more bluntly, a healthy, happy workforce is good for the bottom line.
Right. And you're pointing out how acknowledging the fact that there is a problem isn't just the right thing. It is also one of the factors that will solve a problem for the employers, for the employee. Klint, I want to go back to you and talk a little about what we were talking about earlier when it comes to students and their educational life. Now, as Mr. Sullivan pointed out here, that one of the motivational factors, trying to identify what are some of the problems, trying to solve them, employers being more cognizant about those problems. What kind of creative solutions can exist for students, especially younger solutions, for them to feel more motivated and do better in the future?
That is a very difficult but good question. One of the solutions that I have found with some of my colleagues that really helps is one, changing work environments fairly regularly. And, so we'll have move to different places, sometimes just out in the park or wherever to do work. And that changes up the stress load for the type of work you do in academia, which is research. But I also know that my wife's an attorney that works for a large corporation. There's an aspect to both academic and professional life where you're always being monitored in a sense. And in fact, I know a lot of companies, when you're logged in, they can track just how many hours you've been working and typing. And that creates an underlying stress level that really hasn't been acknowledged as something in the same way that we consider health and safety being a basic part of what any corporation provides its employees, a good, safe environment. We should also view the mental and the psychological aspects of the modern work environment with as much importance, and it really hasn't been addressed in this sort of always being on call, always having to check email, you're at home, emails being sent after work, or the constant digital monitoring is a very stressful sort of underlying thread behind a lot of this.
And Klint, it seems like the expectations of a modern firm have increased exponentially. They want you to be connected 24/7. They want you to put in more hours, but also the surveillance has increased as well. They want you to clock in at a certain time. They want you to clock out of a certain time. With all of this, it seems to just put in more and more pressure on the person to perform. But do you think a person can perform under these circumstances?
Obviously, different personality types handle stress such as this constant surveillance differently. So I think some people, it doesn't bother them, and some people like being within very hierarchical structures and organizations. It makes them feel secure. But for other people, that constant monitoring is just a low-grade stress level. And as Patrick mentioned, there's all sorts of physiological side effects that come along with constant long-term low-level stress that have bigger effects in the long term, but also reduce the performance of employees. Employees are not going to be good problem solvers and committed to the role if they're constantly stressed and they're dealing with the physiological side effects that come along with that stress.
Right. Mr. Sullivan, now going back, talking a little more about what the optimal employee output should be like and what employers should strive to be like, what kind of environment should they create for the employees to feel like they can perform their best. What do you think are some of the standards that should be set and aspire towards?
Well, I mean, one of the main problems is the idea of job security has now sort of gone out of the window. I mean, it used to be that people would have a job for life. So doing something in relation to that is going to be very important. I mean, we've got the fourth industrial revolution sort of just over the horizon. And I think the problems we're seeing now are just the tip of the iceberg. Things are going to get worse before they get better. A number of jobs, which currently exist, will be done by sort of AI in 15 years. The other problem is, people used to work within their local communities. There's now a real lack of community. And, in big cities like London, it's one of the biggest cities in the world, but it's one of the loneliest cities in the world, according to studies. There was a revolutionary book that 2 decades ago called Bowling Alone by a social scientist called Robert Putnam. talking about the amount of sort of recorded incidents of people going bowling to a bowling alley alone. So creating a sense of community and those sort of social human ties, I think, is the best thing that a company could do.
Right. But why do you think, with everything that's happening, that just doesn't seem to be on the list of priorities? I mean, we're talking about unemployment. Of course, the company, at the end of the day, wants to invest in cutthroat technology. They do want to make sure their costs are at the lowest, but there are also macroeconomic factors at play. In all of this, are we putting too much pressure on these companies alone?
Well, I mean, that's why these pressures are exactly why somebody like Donald Trump won in America, because you had entire communities of workers, sort of people who got high school diplomas, hadn't gone to college, sort of blue-collar workers who worked in the sort of industrial manufacturing sector, who had their jobs suddenly disappear, go to Mexico or wherever, and as a result, people wanted to protect those jobs. And if you look at some communities in America where the jobs have gone, they suddenly got this massive opioid epidemic, which is it's just huge. Because once you've taken away the reason for people working, the reason for people to sort of get up in the morning, there are all sorts of social knock-on effects, as it were. Right.
Klint, on that point, all the socio-political factors that we witness today with the rise of right-wing governments all across the world, and especially in developed parts of the world, do you feel like it is this corporate culture at play, the fact that corporations, capitalism has favored money over the human factor, one of the main contributions to this?
Yes, there is a factor relating to money, but two, I think a bigger factor might be, and as Patrick alluded to or talked about, this lack of community. As people have had to move away from sort of smaller agrarian communities, move to the cities to find work, and people's relationship with churches and social institutions and organizations like that have started falling apart. There's direct correlation with crime and opiate abuse and things like that when you're not around a strong community of peers. And in the United States, at least, I'm from an area you would probably call Trump country. The fact that a lot of people were losing the jobs or the jobs that their fathers had had or their parents had that had paid, for a happy life are no longer there. It has devastated parts of middle America. And it's a discussion about the trades, the working class, that is not often had in the academic world. And it's often, I feel like the academic world is really sort of out of touch with the working class populations anywhere in the West. And this is a discussion that's not being had in academia. And I think it's really important, particularly when we talk about privilege and other aspects associated with class structures.
Right. And those are important points and questions to have, and hopefully we will have them in the future. Thank you so much for joining us, Klint Janulis from Oxford and Patrick Sullivan from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.